Hi, this is Uncle Matt's D&D Studio. I'm Matt Finch, and I'm here for video part 3 with Greg Gillespie. And now what we're doing is just talking about the videos that we just made and blowing off steam and letting our hair down after it, because there's sort of an adrenaline rush when you're making one of these things, and now we can kick back. How'd it go?
I think it went very well. I mean, the thing that, when you have as you pointed out, the topic is so vast that you really only touch it's like an iceberg, right? You're just what you can see, and then there's what's under the water, and you can really just, it's just a sort of a superficial discussion because there's so many interesting things that you could delve into in more detail.
It is really, that's one of the downsides of the video format. I mean, I think it's a lot more direct, and people get a lot from seeing the people who are talking, and sort of you can almost see the thought processes when people are, all right, something that I have to think hard about. But matter of doing zillions and zillions of videos or putting something in writing, which I do from time to time. Have you written any of the sort of dungeon theory stuff, like what I've written in Gabor Lux and so on? Have you written any of that stuff?
No, I haven't. My part of it is just my sort of approach to social media and the OSR and that sort of thing. I don't know, sometimes there's shenanigans and things that go on that I don't want to be involved in. And so I just more or less keep my opinions to myself. I don't have a large imprint when it comes to that sort of thing. I'm not actively sort of out there sort of networking and whatnot virtually. So I honestly, my thing is I keep my head down and I roll up my sleeves and go to work and try to make the best stuff that I can, and then let it go, and then see what people have to say about it. And I do, any people have been really great in terms of, sending me questions and constructive criticism, which I do take to heart and reflect on, in the creation and the stuff that I do. So, I haven't written much, but I do have a lot to say on it. And it was certainly nice to have the opportunity to do that here for sure.
And I saw on your syllabus that you do, and I wasn't able to, I guess the parenthetical information you had on the syllabus must have been written sources, because in one of them you were talking about the satanic panic on D&D, and you had Jack Chick referenced there, and I assume he's not coming in as a lecturer. So, but you write, you do lectures where you talk about nostalgia in the OSR. I mean, what do you cover in that?
Well, just in terms of nostalgia gaming. So if we think any, in my sort of academic background, what we do is we situate cultural products and artifacts and performances and activities as texts to be read. Mm-hmm. So then, for example, we could take like a comic book or an album cover or a D&D game, doesn't matter what it is, and we can deconstruct it culturally into its component parts. And then we ask questions about how and why. And so that's sort of how I've gone about the study of nostalgia. And Joe Goodman was very kind enough years ago to work with me and took part in a study that I did looking at his third edition Dungeon Crawl Classic game. So from there, it was just sort of a thing where I was sort of interested in how nostalgia works, and visually and textually, and also my background as a historian. So like what I do is I look at all the different things that Gygax and Arneson have created, and those are my primary sources. Mm-hmm. So if I'm going to do my literature review, it's going to be, okay, well, what did they do, or what did Gygax do, or what did Rob Kuntz do, or whatever in these various examples. And so then I try to think about what I'm doing, and does it relate to what they're doing at all or not, and how did they handle situations. And so then I consider those sort of my primary sources and riff from those.
But that is almost the opposite of nostalgia, because it's there you're talking about stuff that was done before any nostalgia happened. It's people referring back to that for the nostalgia, right? So I mean, why use like, you know, Errol Otis is the one that did the art for the cover of Archaea, right?
Both covers, yeah.
Okay, so
Baramaze and Archaea.
yeah, I didn't remember what the cover of Baramaze looked like. So you know, so Errol has now created something timeless in text that can be deconstructed. I'm not sure how he'd look at that.
Yeah.
Although my favorite comment from Errol, I don't know if you were at the North Texas where he said this, but somebody said, you know, what were the big influences on your work? And he said, well, retroactively, I've been inspired by Albrecht Dürer's prints, and so everyone was enchanted with the idea of retroactive inspiration.
Yeah, well, I think the really cool part, like, because we grew up, you know, with those images and with those modules and things of that nature, we're nostalgic for it. We played it as children. But when you think in that context, that their primary sources were things like folklore pictures and wizards at birthdays doing party tricks with a conical cap and moon-studded robes, and things of that nature. So, I mean, their primary sources are very cool to consider, and comic books and things of that nature, and how those influenced their aesthetic, which created sort of the first Dungeons and Dragons aesthetic. And then you can follow the aesthetic threads from that time period through the editions and the changes in the design of the games and how those are being reflected in the art.
And one of the things that someone pointed this out to me years ago, and it was a fascinating idea, was that at a certain point D&D becomes self-referential. It's had such an effect on fiction that all of a sudden all of the fiction is beginning to reflect Dungeons and Dragons influences, and you get this odd sort of feedback loop in the way that they're developing the game.
I couldn't agree more. That's such an insightful comment.
It wasn't me. Somebody else said it to me. I'm just repeating something.
Well, I can tell you, I think if you look at the art, so as I said earlier, vanilla Dungeons and Dragons, vanilla medieval fantasy is my bag. And having said that, as we advance through the editions, the game departs from medieval fantasy. Now, I'm not of the opinion that because you're using swords and wearing chainmail, it's medieval fantasy. There's a lot more to it than that. But what we've done is we've moved from medieval fantasy through fourth edition to the fantastical. And the fantastical is sort of where the milieu exists right now, and it's detached. That's part of my problem with the game. I do think that, like, I give a big lecture at the start of my history and culture of RPGs course, letting them know there is no difference between reality and fantasy. They're just social constructs.
Okay.
And so,
by the way, I think we hit the time limit. We're just going to let this one run until you get bored, because I think this is this is exactly what I said, that if we do the one that's sort of off topic, it's always more interesting than the actual interview ones. And so I'm fascinated now. So, okay. Tell me what you even mean by there's no difference between reality and fantasy, unless you're just saying that fantasy is a subcomponent of reality because we think it in our brains. So, I mean, what do you mean by that? Social constructs.
Okay, so how do we apprehend our reality, right? So this is obviously a very big discussion. I'll give you the quick version of it. So I deny that reality exists. So people say, okay, well, how do we structure our reality? We do it through things like time. Well, time didn't pre-exist humanity. We invented time. And what day is it on the calendar? Well, the Gregorian calendar has been revised so many times, we don't have any idea what day it is. We can commonly agree that it's October 2nd or whatever, but that doesn't make it so. So,
all right. So you're still, why would you say that a communally defined reality isn't the same as an objective reality? Doesn't that just become a point of irrelevancy?
No, I don't think so.
Epistemology rather than something that's a practical way of looking at things?
Well, just because something is commonly accepted doesn't make it a quote-unquote fact. So what we've done is we've taken the example from the physical sciences, what's called positivism, which is what we can apprehend through our senses our eyes, our smell, our taste, etc. What we can apprehend through our senses, we can then encode into facts, which other people can also encode into facts in a similar manner.
And so that's what you're saying is that's why there's no difference between reality and fantasy, is because they're both social constructs.
Yes, we make them up to suit our time period. And if we can look at examples from human history where there were certain items commonly accepted as fact. Largely, they're influenced by Christianity. So the world is flat, and you'd sail right off it. The whole notion of the sun setting, the sun rising and sun setting. The sun doesn't rise and set; we rotate. But the belief that we were put on this earth for this earth was provided for us by God. We are the center of the universe, and everything rotates around us. Thankfully, we've debunked all these things. So, but they were encoded as facts because the church told us so. Now, fantasy, for example, we play roles every day in our lives. So we play father, we play son, we play employee, we play whatever various roles. And we're so accustomed to doing that because we've been doing it as children, we don't think twice about it. But we move from one role to the other, and we think that we're the same person through all these roles, and we're not. It's normalized behavior. So then when people sit down and they role play for the first time, you hear giggles and things of that nature because they're not sure what to do. And there's role dissonance because they don't know what their role is, and they don't know how to act in that milieu. So that's another example. And of course, we can look at other things so the whole notion of astronauts landing in the sea, that came from film. They poached that from film. Let me tell you about the groovy 1960s TV show where they had personal communicators and computers that were on desks and high frequency ultrasounds and whatnot. And, we imagine those things in with the screen of Star Trek before we ever made them. So.
Right. Okay. So what's the implication of all right. So I see there's a definite mental construct here that's moving toward an idea of what's going on in the role-playing game. People are they're taking on unfamiliar roles and getting a reward from doing that. And I lost the thread of what I was saying, but
yeah, all I'm trying to say is there's no difference between sitting at a table and playing Thundar the Barbarian versus me going to work and playing Professor.
Okay. So where were you going to go? You raised the issue of there's no distinction between fantasy and reality, and you were going somewhere with that. Let's get on to where were you going with that now?
Well, what I'm trying to do is, so my students have had it beat into them since kindergarten that there's reality and there's fantasy, and they're very different and compartmentalized. And what I'm saying is it's a binary construct. And we need one of the first things I do is I try to shake the foundation of those two concepts for my students. Mm-hmm. And then we think about, roles, and I give them examples where we consider roles, where we have role conflict in our everyday lives. And then again, it's not a big jump to sit down at a table and play a particular role in a fantasy game. It's a distinction we've made in our minds, and I don't acknowledge it.
Okay, now you were talking about how in, I guess it's 5th edition that you were talking about, because we started with the whole it's self deities become self-referential.
Yes,
and then you had talked about how it had gone from medieval fantasy to the fantastical, mm-hmm. And how those were not the same. And so what's the difference that we've got between the medieval fantasy that we can talk about in the Gygax Arneson days and the fantastical now that we've got, I guess, in 5th edition? If you don't mean 5th edition, clarify that.
Well, certainly in 4th edition, the dungeon punk aesthetic of 3rd edition, and so on and so forth. So what we're getting are, instead of something that would resemble practical plate mail. We get examples where everything is sharp and pointy, such that you couldn't brush past your fellow adventurer without cutting them on the edges of your plate mail. That's an example of where we've gone from medieval fantasy to the fantastical, and it's now self-referential. That it's not logical. And when you do that, the game loses its grounding for me personally. So
now, how much have you looked at the 5th edition stuff?
Not too much. I did some of the playtest stuff and some of the laser cleric powers and things put me right off. So I do, obviously there are people that, enjoy the game and love the game. And I think that having a base game and then being able to graph things on it was definitely a good decision on their part. So there are things I definitely sort of agree with. But the aesthetic is definitely not for me. It's not, the visuals are not for me.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. There's some of their stuff that I like in the visuals of 5th edition, and some that I don't. I think the style of it, I mean, you've got, here's a good one for you. Okay, so the difference between black and white line art in the older books and the full color art that comes out, nowadays in pretty much everything. It's an industry standard nowadays for pretty much all of that. Now, here's my thing that I've always said is that there's two entirely different approaches to reading the book. You're in a different role when you read the two books. You read one of those black and white ones as written by Gary Gygax, and you are reading something that is in the now, in the game. You've got sort of medieval bestiary looking pictures, and granted there's a lot of stuff in the rules, but it's almost like he's saying, yes, here are ogres. Ogres exist. Here's information about ogres. By the way, they've got 4+1 hit dice. But that almost rolled right into the thing, as if you had the guy writing the medieval bestiary taking the additional notes that they have 4+1 hit dice. Mm-hmm. Whereas now, and so you were at one step removed. It was somebody writing about the world, whereas in the full color sort of aesthetic, you don't have that additional removed step. When you look at something that is in full color and closer to photographic sort of appearance, you're looking directly into the fantasy world, and I think that's what the art directors are trying to get you to do. Is the much more it's going to grab you. You're looking at the world. You're not reading about the world. What do you think about that distinction? Valid, invalid, dumb, what?
No, I think there's something to it. So as I look at the older aesthetic stuff, you don't see ripped biceps and huge traps where the adventurers look like they just left the gym. And okay, so we've got these weak-kneed, weak-armed adventurers. That's self-reflexive, because we as kids and now as adults, we look at that and we could very easily, we're invited, artists like Errol Otis invite us to take the position of the protagonist in the art. We can do that because how many of us are benching 225 30 times? It's easier for us to do that. And it's also funny because they're getting their asses handed to them most of the time.
Yeah.
And the people like Errol and from that generation that played the game, who were playing these characters who got their asses handed to them, they were showing that in the art. This is what happened. This is how the game was played.
I really like some of the Tom Wham art when you look at his pictures of adventurers, not necessarily in D&D stuff, but he was writing a lot of other, and you look at his adventurers and you really get that whole wow, these are not only realistic, they're the gamer versions of these things going in. They become caricatures of the whole thing.
Yes. Yeah, right. So it's taking it a standard deviation or two farther away. So then if we advance and we're playing a game that's an edition farther along, that's a little bit more of a heroic game, then instead of the monsters taking up the majority of the visual space and being above the adventurers, now the adventurers or the heroes are taking up the majority of the visual space and the monsters are underneath them. So I do feel that the art of, say, 4th edition and what have you does reflect the game in its design principles. It's just not for me. So, to each their own. It's just, I think I like the humor. I don't want to be in a situation necessarily where I'm in control. I want to bring my intellectual resources and the collaborative process that we have as fellow gamers at the table. I want to bring those to bear to a situation and see if we can puzzle our way through things. I just don't want to start waving my sword at the slightest pretense. So I think that there's humor in the older style art. I think we are invited to take the role of the protagonist, from my point of view, a little easier than perhaps some of the more buff art, which is also reflecting video games and things. So I understand where all that's coming from. But so there's all that. And also too, like the students that I have that are 17 and 18, they're playing microwave fantasy. This whole notion where you play an adventure for a year and you make it to level 3 or level 5 or whatever, that's gone for them. They want immediate gratification. It's a fast food, selfie taking, hypermobile world, and they want that gratification of level advancement very quickly, and they want their characters to look like heroes very quickly. So I understand, the context outside the game as well.
Yeah, no, that's true. And all right, cool. Well, we're at this point way over. I'm going to have to probably put another split in there because we went on for a long time. But that was freaking awesome. In terms of getting some interesting stuff out there that I don't think a lot of people focus on. So,
well, just make it like a big addendum to the first 2 videos. How's that?
Yeah, right. Here's the footnote that's longer than the entire actual thing on it. So, all right, sometime in the future, I'm going to pull you back in and we'll revisit all of this. But
that'd be fantastic.
All right, awesome. So for now, everybody, whatever type of D&D it is that you play, imagine the hell out of it.